Why might Palantir be one of the best stocks to own during a recession? This is an incredibly interesting question and thought I've had really over the past couple months as we've been seeing that there is likely going to be, if not we're already in a technical recession, a much larger recession than we have right now. CPI data came out today. Inflation increased 0.4% in September, more than expected despite rate hikes, which means the Fed is increasing the Fed's funds rates 75 bips. They've done it for the past couple times. They're probably going to do it another time November 2nd. And that is still not majorly slowing down inflation, leading us to believe that inflation is a rampant problem that will take a longer time to get rid of, and that market forces right now are not naturally getting rid of inflation with interest rates. So the question becomes, if we're going to have massive levels of inflation, or at least inflation not going down anytime soon, and we are going to have a hawkish Fed that is not really hawkish, they just have to do what's in response to inflation. Either you have the Cathie Wood argument, where deflation is coming, and you believe that, and you don't raise interest rates, or you look at the data and you're like, we think that inflation is not going away, which means we need to raise interest rates. And as a result of raising interest rates, high growth tech companies get slaughtered. This is part of the reason. It's very important to understand why Cathie Wood and Elon Musk are 1000% in agreement on not raising interest rates, or at least slowing down the rate of interest rates, because when interest rates go up, the cost of capital becomes more expensive. And as a result of that, high growth tech companies that are valued on profits they're making or cash flows they're making in the future, far into the future, because they're growing now, losing money now to grow in the future. Example, Facebook back in 2008, they didn't make money for a good 4 or 5 years, but they collected 1 billion people to use the platform. And then they started monetizing, but they needed the capital to subsidize their ability to lose money in the short term in order to gain money and gain market share in the social media space for the long term. That's what companies like DraftKings want to do. That's what companies like Palantir want to do, right? They could have been operationally profitable last year, 500 million off 1.5 billion, 29% operating margin, but they had excessive stock-based compensation, which drowned out the profits. Why is that the case? Because they need the best talent, because they're investing for the future. They believe this is a company that can 20x one day, but you can't do that with crappy talent, which means you need to pay people. So there's all these different things that growth tech companies have to do in the short term in order to be able to survive for the long term. If interest rates are high, inflation is not going away, the macro is not getting any better, then companies like Palantir are not going to do that well. However, this argument that I'm about to present is a multifaceted argument for why I believe it is still a good company to hold during inflationary times. Now, let me set the precedent with what I'm about to make is a geopolitical argument. And that geopolitical argument is highly contingent upon if my geopolitical analysis is correct, and not really correct, but my prediction is more correct. And that prediction is more rooted in what Alex Karp, CEO of Palantir, has been saying, and some of the other market forces that I've been seeing over the past couple months. So first thing, before I even get to geopolitics, let's just talk. The first reason I think they could potentially do well is the government. The government in the United States spent $780 billion on defense. Palantir got $800 million of deals, not just for 1 year, but over 4 or 5 years, but $800 million of deals closed. One of them was Project Maven, $229 million for 1 year, last month in September. And so you think about a company that is in deep ties with the government. U.S. government is incredibly sticky revenue. When you're in the U.S. government, it's hard for them to get out, especially if your content, if your software is good, and the context of how your of how the government is operationalizing your product is actually meaningful for them. Then that means you're going to continue to get revenue from them. And so off a $780 billion budget, if you're able to pull in $800 million in 1 month, that's excluding all the other deals they've been able to get over the past year in 2022. That to me means that even when a recession happens, the one thing that doesn't stop spending is the government, because the government needs to keep us safe. The government needs to keep the lights on, things like that. Is the government cheap? Yes. And will deals maybe go down in value? Sure. But the government's not going to stop spending. And so Palantir is in a prime position to be able to compete and win multi-$100 million contracts from the U.S. government, because they've done it before. They've proved they can do it. They've executed on getting those contracts. And that is revenue that is sticking with them for the near term and for the long term as we cycle out of a recession. This is all a question of, is it 2024? Is it 2025? Is it going to be 2023? Is it 2026? How long do we have to be in a bear market? Because we've been in a bull market theoretically for the past 10 years with artificial levels of liquidity in the market, pumping trillions of dollars, and low interest rates. So in that case, if a bear market does last, and I don't think it'll last 4 or 5 years, but if it does last that long, what are companies that can withstand that and don't just wither away because of high interest rates and inflation? So you've got the one thing, you've got governmental revenue, which I think is incredibly important, and it's going to be a great driver for Palantir, and it's only going to compound on itself. The second reason to this is governmental revenue in other parts of the world. Governmental revenue, so for example, Palantir just got IL6 certification with the US federal government. For those that don't know what that is, IL6 certification is the highest level of security clearance you can get within the US Department of Defense. Only 2 other companies have that, Microsoft and Amazon. Both of them are trillion-dollar companies. Palantir's a $16 billion company. Now, I'm not saying it's an apples-to-apples comparison, but you gotta at least be interested. Like, $2 trillion tech companies have access to this clearance and certification, and then you've got little old Palantir that has that hasn't become the behemoths that those companies have become yet. And if it even becomes, 1/5 of those behemoths, that's still a great return from this price right now. So at that point, you're like, okay, they are one of 3 companies in the world that has IL6 certification with the greatest, freest democracy on the planet, which is the United States. What precedent does that set to all the other European nations that exist? What precedent does that set to all the other countries that have started to see the ramifications of not having actual software at your disposal in order to have defense, which we'll talk about in a second? I think that sends them a message that says we should probably get that under control. And as a result of getting that under control, I think there is a better chance for Palantir to get more governmental deals in Europe beyond, which, I've talked to people like Coatstrap, who's if you're in the Palantir community, you know who he is. He thinks that NATO is a $100 billion market itself for Palantir. He thinks the government is a $100 billion market itself, given the current crises we're going through and the world we're going in, which is going to be my third reason. But the first 2 reasons are US government should be sticky revenue for Palantir, and US government and Palantir's amazing, IL6 certification and ability to execute should set the precedent for European governments out into the future, where even CARP has admitted they haven't done the best job at being able to secure those deals. Okay, third reason, and this is sort of the reason that's going to encapsulate everything else that's going on right now. The world is becoming more deglobalized. When Alex Karp just did an interview with Stanley Druckenmiller, which is a legendary investor and one of their earliest investors, the argument that he was making was that if we're going towards a more deglobalized world, Russia invading Ukraine, China taking sides with Russia, India siding with Russia, but India is supposed to be a democracy. India is supposed to be it, but they're still buying Russian oil. Like, if the world is deglobalizing, which means technologies and companies can't intersect and trade with each other and have sort of the open borders to be able to do what they need to do, then that means societies are becoming more individualistic and individualized to their own territory, more nationalistic, one would say. If that's the case, then that is a very dangerous world to be in from a variety of perspectives. Number one, imagine if China were to invade Taiwan. Imagine if China were to be less friendlier to a lot of other nations. If all companies have left out of Russia because of what Russia has done to Ukraine, they would have no choice but to do the same to China. They can't keep their supply chains there. So that would flip supply chains and logistics overnight. I mean, that would change everything if there was another geopolitical crisis at this level. The second reason is that if there is less deglobalized things, if there's a more deglobalized world, there's less what you could say alliances and more enemies, which means dictatorial authoritarian regimes like Russia would feel the ability for them to just do whatever they want and potentially bluff or not bluff that they're using tactical nukes, like be this crazy type of country, because the world is becoming deglobalized and the world doesn't care about being together. The beautiful thing about globalization, for all the bad things that existed, was that if the world is as one, then everyone tries to get along with each other, even if there are massive levels of differences between countries from religions, perspectives, political perspectives, whatever it may be. If that's changing, which is what Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, was saying, that he feels this is what's happening. He was right to call out in January that there might be some issues with Russia and Ukraine. He was right to say that nuclear war has been on the highest level it's been. People thought he was fear-mongering. And, Palantir haters like, oh, he just wants World War III. It's like, no, this is what's actually happening, and he is responding to what's actually happening. Is that a good thing for Palantir? Yes, and we'll talk about why. Good meaning not nuclear war, but the threat of that being good, because then their software actually starts to make sense for a lot of countries if they take that threat seriously. But he was basically telling it as it is. So if my third reason is that the world is getting more deglobalized, then that means countries are going to want to value software that can protect their sovereignty, their nationality, and their agency from being invaded from a dictatorial regime. Because when a dictatorial authoritarian regime feels that the world is less deglobalized, so it doesn't matter if they're part of the UN or not, and they're just going to do whatever the hell they want, then what software can you give Poland that doesn't have nuclear weapons to be able to defend itself against a country like Russia invading it? And the beauty of what Karp is speaking about is that if they can create a software product, which they've theoretically already created, that is able to give nuclear powers metaphorically to countries that don't have nuclear weapons, how much could that help defend those countries against horrible dictatorial authoritarian regimes and actually give them the ability to protect their own Western values and Western freedoms? That, to me, is going to be a very interesting thing that plays out over the next 5 years in the context of software, because not every country can get a nuke, but every country can pay a couple $1 billion for some software, especially if that saves your country from dying. Then we talk about the commercial sector. All the companies that are in China, if they have to flip their supply chains overnight, they need data optimization. They need supply chain optimization. They need a magic power to figure out how do we continue to conduct business even though everything we're doing has been flipped upside its head. Palantir has talked about how they worked with companies like BMW when they were exiting out of Russia to be able to deal with their supply chains from a data and analytics perspective. If the world is getting more deglobalized, if interest rates continue to rise, if inflation does not go away, then you have to ask yourself, what are the companies that exist that would be able to resolve some of these macro level problems, that would be able to help you through these macro level problems? If all of this happens and the market tanks, there is a possibility, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's a possibility that Palantir performs inverse against the market, where a geopolitical crisis actually makes Palantir a better buy, not because anyone wants World War III, but because countries recognize the threat of World War III is so severe, and they need the most pristine forms of software to stop their countries from being hurt, or to at least understand that if they do get invaded, they have the software, they have the intelligence, they have the capabilities to protect themselves and to actually try to fight in a war, which is what Ukraine is doing right now against Russia. Then that could mean that there really is big demand for Palantir's product. I never invested Palantir for these reasons, by the way. I invested because I thought their software was amazing, and I thought in the commercial sector they would end up being in part of every vertical across the entire world. And over the next 10 years, this would play out to be an amazing AI data analytics company. I started to recognize that they're also a protector of Western freedoms, and that's a really important thing. And there's a lot of philosophy associated with that, which means if you're a Palantir shareholder, you have to dive deep and understand that stuff. But on top of that, you have to recognize that the world is getting more dangerous. And if the world is getting more dangerous, what are the companies that are going to be able to help people that are the victims of a more dangerous world? So those are my 3 points for why I think Palantir is a decent investment to hold during an investment or during an inflationary crisis. You've got governmental revenue. You've got the precedent for that governmental revenue to expand, which means just billions and billions of dollars of opportunities for them to actually protect themselves. And then you've got the commercial sector and the governmental sector being flipped over its head if you have massive deglobalization and more geopolitical crises, which means a company like Palantir would be there to help protect other different nations. I don't know if all that stuff is going to play out. That is my thesis. My overarching thesis for the next 10 years is that I think in the commercial sector, they're going to be beasts and they're going to grow. But those would be my 3 reasons for why Palantir is still a good stock to hold during inflationary times. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.